This week I wanted to go through the list of the 100 greatest books ever written in rapid fire and see which ones I have read, what I thought of them, which ones I think weren't maybe worth being on that list, and so on. Next on the list is Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, and I have not read this one before. I've heard it's good. I think there's some satire in there, maybe something. I don't know a whole lot about it, but it does seem interesting, and I do want to read it eventually. Oh, I know. Next on the list is The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. And this is another one, I've read parts of it. This is where you get the whole, like, it's better to be feared than loved thing. I probably should reread it. I do actually have a copy of it somewhere. Maybe not. Maybe I don't. But I do want to read it eventually because I think it's interesting stuff. Next on the list is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I've talked about this book at length. I love it. It's so good. Empowered women. The fact that this was kind of told from her point of view, first person, was sort of groundbreaking for the time. The fact that you get kind of this interior look at sort of what's going on inside her mind was really kind of daring for the day. And the book centers on her. It doesn't center on kind of any male characters. This is definitely worth reading, and I still love it so much. I do want to reread this one eventually one day. All right, next up we've got some plays. We've got Hamlet by William Shakespeare. This is my Norton Shakespeare collection, The Tragedies. Hamlet's wonderful. I love it so much. It's one of my favorites. It's so good. And then we've got Pygmalion by Bernard Shaw, George Bernard Shaw. And that's another one I have not read, but it's the basis for the play, or the play and the musical My Fair Lady. And which is in turn based off of the Greek myth of Pygmalion, where he like created, what is it, Galatea, where he creates the sculpture and falls in love with it, and the sculpture turns alive, kind of like the perfect woman that he created, kind of thing. But yeah. Next one is another George Bernard Shaw. This is Candida. Again, I know nothing about this. I wonder if it's related to Candide, or if it's a adaptation of that. Again, I know nothing about this one, so we're just gonna move on. Next on the list is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I have read this one. It's not great. It's kind of notable for being one of the first English novels. I think it's like the first English novel. And there's stuff in there that's good, I guess. Adventure, stranded on a desert island and whatever. But there's the ship that shipwrecks is a slave trader ship. And once he gets on the island, he meets a indigenous person that he names Friday. And it's just very master-servant or master-slave thing, and it's not great. Don't think I'll ever reread that one. Next up is another tragedy. We've got Romeo and Juliet. And this is one that I really, really love. And I'm glad that people are reevaluating it now. We're seeing a lot of really interesting commentary on Romeo and Juliet, because it's not really a love story. It's a tragedy. It's about dumb kids and stupid grudges and a flare-up that kills like 5 people. It's good though. Romeo and Juliet's great. And my favorite version of it, no, it isn't the Baz Luhrmann one, although that one is great. The British Television Shakespeare collection that the BBC did in like the 70s and 80s, their version of Romeo and Juliet is actually incredible. It's the full play, and it's just really good. Like it affected me at the end. The casting is really, really good, and I really, really liked how it was done. So would recommend that version. It's on BritBox, but you can also get like the box set of all the plays. Next up on the list is more Shakespeare. We've got A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is one of my favorite comedies, up there with Much Ado About Nothing. But it's just gorgeous. It's beautiful. The language is wonderful. The characters are memorable. I love it so much. My favorite adaptation is the movie version with Callista Flockhart and Michelle Pfeiffer and Stanley Tucci. It's just great. It's so good. Midsummer Night's Dream is gorgeous, and I love it so much. Next on the list is The Cherry Orchard by Anton Chekhov. I have not read much by Chekhov. I've read some of his plays. I think I read The Seagull, but I have not read The Cherry Orchard. And likewise, the next one on the list is Three Sisters by Anton Chekhov, and that's another one I have not read. I don't know anything about it. I'm sorry. Next on the list is The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. Gorgeous, beautiful. This is the Tennyson? No, Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow translation. And it's so good. I love it. It's beautiful, it's evocative, it's scary, it's uplifting, it's great. And there's so much political satire in here. That's just wonderful. It's so good, and I love this poem. Epic poetry in Italian. Next on the list is Confucius's Analects. I have not read this. I don't know anything about it. Confucius, it's another philosophical work, but I don't know anything about it, I'm sorry. Next up, we have the collected poems of William Butler Yeats. This is one of my favorite poets. His stuff is great. He was a modernist poet, but he kind of merges out of the Romantics and the Victorians and such, and kind of goes into the modernism. So his earlier stuff is very pastoral, lots of Irish folklore and Irish history, Irish poetic, like poetic traditions, and then he kind of goes into more of the kind of modernist, breaking apart things and reassembling the world in new ways. But an incredible poem. I love him so much. And if you have not read anything by him, check it out. His poem, The Second Coming, is quoted everywhere. It's like if you have a show that wants like a really profound poetic allusion, they'll usually use The Second Coming. But like, read his other stuff because it's just beautiful. There's one called The Wild Swans at Cooley or something. The Wild Swans at Cooley, yeah. Cooley, 1919. That book, we read this in class. We read that poem in class, and it was one of those ones where we got to the end of it, and the whole class just kind of sat there in stunned silence for a few minutes because we were all so, like, taken in by the poem. It's gorgeous, just wonderful. Love it so much. Next up, we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a wonderful book. It's creepy, it's very gay, it's satirical, it makes fun of everything. Anytime I get to chapter 11 in any book, I remember the experience of chapter 11 in this one, and I always wonder if that was where like chapter 11 bankruptcy came from. It probably isn't, but chapter 11 in this book is just him going nuts with consumerism and just buying everything. It's just lists and lists of all the things that he purchases, the things he commissions, the things he takes in, and it's just over the top and ridiculous. And yeah, this book is great, and I love it, and the ending is creepy, and it's so good. Next on the list is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Yes, this is the movie version, but it was a used book that I saved. So I have not read this one actually, but I want to. Like satire of high society and drama and all that kind of stuff, and I think it is it's interesting, but I've heard that it kind of gets really bleak, so I'm kind of curious to see where that goes. So I don't know, I do want to read this one. Next up is The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. I have read this one. It's kind of like the Canterbury Tales. It's a collection of stories that are told by a group of people over 10 days. That's why it's called the Decameron. Over 10 days while they're kind of, I think the plague is happening outside, I think, or there's some kind of unrest, but they're all locked up in this castle, the rich people, and they all tell these tales, and it's great. Some are very bawdy, some are fun, some are sad. It's a good collection, and if you can find a good translation, it really brings it alive, and it's a lot of fun. Next up is Beowulf, the epic poem. Again, I have Stephen Mitchell's translation because I do like him, even though a lot of people don't. Seamus Heaney's translation is probably the gold standard. It's engaging, it's compelling, and you've also got, like, it's bilingual, so you get to see, like, the Old English on the left-hand side, and it's really, really great. But if you have not read Maria Devana Haley's translation of Beowulf, you need to. This is sometimes called the Bro translation of Beowulf. The first word in the poem is Hwet, H-W-A-E-T, and it's translated in lots of different ways, like lo, hark, listen, all that kind of stuff. And this book translates that as bro, and it's so good. It's a good mix of, like, modern vernacular and the contemporary, like, it really captures the soul and spirit of Beowulf, and it's so good. So yeah, definitely read this. She also has a novel written that's based on Beowulf called The Mere Wife, so that's another one. Definitely check that out. Next up on the list is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Such a good book. I love this one so much. Very modern. You've got this woman who kind of just says, I'm going to take a lover, and she has an affair very publicly, and there's scandal, and then that's contrasted with this other guy, Levin, who has kind of this good existence that he, like, works towards, and he supports his family, and he cares about his wife, and the contrast between the two stories is great, and it's just, this is a work of genius, and I love it so much, and I will never stop talking about Anna Karenina. Next on the list is another one I've never heard of. It's The Stories of Guy de Maupassant. I probably pronounced that wrong, but don't know anything about this one, so I cannot comment on it. Although the next one in the book I have read, and that's The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. The Time Machine's great. It's a short novel. I think the first time I read this, I read the entire thing in one night, and I did not sleep that night. And I don't regret it because it's really good. Very apocalyptic, lots of commentary on, like, society, and the scene with, like, the dying sun and the crabs on the beach will stay with you forever. Next up is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I have read this one. I don't have it anymore. This was the basis of the movie Apocalypse Now. It's good. It's engaging. It's very much a modernist novel in that it subverts the expectations of kind of the jungle adventure. And so you've got this boat going down the river, you know, going towards a final confrontation with this person who's gone rogue. And it's interesting, but I don't know, Conrad's prose just doesn't really connect with me in some way, so not sure why. Next on the list is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This is another one. I have not read this one yet. It's big. I'm a little intimidated by it, but I do want to read it because I love Russian literature, and I love Anna Karenina so much, so I do want to read this one. A lot of people are reading this online right now, going through it kind of a chapter at a time, and I've missed out on that, but, oh, the text is very small. Yeah, this is a really long one, but I do want to read it, and when I'm done, I can use this as a weapon to defend myself when someone breaks in to get mad at me for saying that I didn't like Joseph Conrad, so I can hit them over the head with this. But not really, because violence is never the answer. Next, we have Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I do want to read this one. I have not read it yet. Louisa May Alcott is a really interesting character, or like a really interesting person. And I've read their short stories, what they called Blood and Thunder Tales. They're like thrillers, and they're really, really good. So I do want to read this one. This was kind of the book that made them famous and popular, and I've heard it's good. Next up, we have the book The Talisman by Sir Walter Scott. I have not read anything by Sir Walter Scott. He was another one of those very early novelists, and I think he also wrote Ivanhoe, which is another one that I have not read, but I've heard it's good. Next up is Tests of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. I have not read anything by Thomas Hardy. I find him a little scary because his stuff is so bleak and hopeless and tragic that I just don't really want to read that one. But the next on the list is Alice in Wonderland, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This one's great, kind of a classic of children's literature. There's a lot of like, it's a good metaphor for like what it's like being a kid, where you have Like, you're thrown into random situations you don't understand, and you have adults telling you to recite things that you don't really think is useful, and just the chaos of being a child. Now, with that said, Lewis Carroll himself was not a great guy. There's still good stuff to be found in here, but just be aware that Lewis Carroll was not a good person. He was bad. We're making progress, I swear. Next up is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Classic, I love it. If you haven't gone through Dracula Daily, or if you're going through it right now, you should, because it's so good. An absolute classic Gothic literature. The characters are all wonderful. The character arcs are really satisfying, especially Mina and Jonathan. Like, everyone always kind of cast Jonathan as like this sad, simpering, kind of quiet, passive person. But like, by the end of the book, he's got knives, and he like goes nuts, and it's great. So good character, you know, love it. Next is The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I probably pronounced that wrong, I'm so sorry. I've not read this one, but I think it's good. Next up is the book The Red and the Black by Stendhal. I've never heard of this one, don't know anything about it. We're gonna move on. I have heard of the next one though. The next one is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is one of his short novels. It's so good. The ending is sad and tragic, and the character of Madame Defarge is just one of those iconic Dickensian characters who just stays with you the whole time. This one is so good. Next up is Plato's Republic. I've read part of it, but I have not read all of it. I don't know anything about it aside from the sections that I have read. It's sort of set up as a dialogue between Plato and Socrates, I think, and discussing of like what the perfect form of government would be. And I think this is where we get like the philosopher king's concept of like the ideal ruler, but I have not read it. Next up, the collected poems of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is wonderful. I love her, one of my favorite poets, but I kind of feel bad that all of her stuff was published, because Emily Dickinson was an intensely private person, and all of these poems were, or most of these poems were like kept in her home, locked up. And so she wrote for herself only, or for people she cared about. And I'm sorry, Emily, that all of your private thoughts are now very public, but your poetry is so good. I'm sorry. Next on the list is Faust by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And this is another one. It's a play. I have not read it, but I think I need to, because this is where we get like the Faustian deal. Marlowe told the same story with the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. I think the original German version is one that I definitely want to read, because it's important to the kind of Western culture. It's very influential. Next up, we have Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. I've not read this one. I don't know anything about it. Yeah, haven't read it. Next up is The Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. I've read some of them, but I have not read all of them. Definitely worth reading, but they are a little dense, and they're very legalese, and full of jargon, so I don't know how fun that experience would be, but I think it is worth reading just to kind of see what the founders sort of thought of what the American Constitution could have been. Next on the list is Silas Marner by George Eliot. I have not read this one. I loved Middlemarch, and I want to read more of Eliot's work, and so this one is definitely one that I do want to read. Next is The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. I've read Common Sense, but I haven't read Rights of Man. So this is another one. I don't know anything about this one. I'm sorry. Moving on. Next up is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. This is a collection of poems. Walt Whitman was very influential. I know he was a big influence on Allen Ginsberg, who was kind of like the second coming of Walt Whitman in the 20th century. I don't know a whole lot about this one. I read it, but it didn't stay in my head. I don't know, it wasn't really my cup of tea. I know that's terrible, but yeah, it wasn't really my thing, and I can't tell you anything about it. But the next one on the list I can. Next up is Billy Budd by Herman Melville. This is a short novel, almost a novella. It's like this big. Billy Budd is great. It's another seafaring story. You've got this kind of almost naive, angelic character who, well, something happens to them. It's really gripping, and you get the great phrase, the oozy weeds, which I think is pretty great. So yeah, Billy Budd is great. If you're scared of Moby Dick and think it's too huge and terrifying, definitely read Billy Budd. It's short, it's really good, and it'll give you a good sense of just how good a writer Melville was. Next up is The Confessions by St. Augustine. I've read sections of this in college, but again, it's completely lost my brain. I cannot remember anything from this list. That's terrible. Oh. Next up, we have The Complete Tales and Poems by Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is wonderful. Just everything. I mean, a lot of his stuff has kind of become cliche at this point, but his stuff is either gothic, or it's terrifying, or it's funny, or he writes mysteries as well. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is a really good example of that. Really, really clever short stories. Ligeia is one that I really, really like. An important figure, and we need to give him lots of love because his family history is so tragic. If you read his biography of like what happened to his family, it almost becomes funny because people in his family just kept suffering horrible, horrible tragedies over and over and over again, and you're like, okay, friend, are you okay? But Edgar Allan Poe is wonderful. His works are great, and the poem The Raven is so good, and yes, good stuff. Next on the list, we've got Ivanhoe by Walter Scott. This is another one I have not read. I think this is a medieval novel, adventure story kind of thing, but I don't know anything about it, and I have not read it. That's terrible. Next up, we've got Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler. This is another one. I don't know anything about this one. I've not heard of it before. The title is kind of captivating. I'm curious what it's about. But apparently it was really important to Edwardian England, and so that's like early 20th century. And that is kind of a big deal. So I don't know, maybe I need to check this one out if I ever find it. So I'll be on the lookout. Next on the list is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. I love this book. I've talked about it at length on this channel. Plays with form, plays with structure, plays with point of view. It's compelling. You've got Southern Gothic. The world around them is falling apart, and not all of them want to move into the future. And this is such a good book. Faulkner is a big favorite of mine, and would recommend this one. Next is another book by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and that's Crime and Punishment. And I have not read this one, but I want to. I keep saying I like Russian literature, but I've only read, I think, 2 books by Russian authors. That's so bad. So I need to fix this, and I do want to read Dostoevsky, and Crime and Punishment is on my list, so don't come at me. Next up, we've got The Household Tales by the Brothers Grimm. They're kind of Grimm's fairy tales. They went around and they collected the stories from the villages and towns and such kind of in their area throughout Germany. And they really wanted to kind of preserve these stories. And so the Grimm's fairy tales are often very kind of bleak, and because they came out of a life of hardship and teaching hard lessons to children. And so they're very important. So yes, would recommend these. They're kind of sad. I know the German version of Cinderella, it's called Aschenputtel, which stands for Ash Fool, and it's a very very different story from the Disney version. We're down to the final 3. We've got The Adventures of Huck Finn by Mark Twain. This one is good. It's been kind of controversial. I think a lot of times there's negative reactions and among parents to the use of the N-word in this one, but I will say this book is not a racist book. It was Twain writing to an audience to persuade them to not be racist. And so he uses kind of everyday vernacular, in writing the characters, and so there's words and stuff that are used that are very much offensive today. But the intent behind it was not to demean. He was seeking to unravel the racism that he was very offended by in kind of society. Now, it was, you know, late 19th century, early 20th century, and so like not a lot changed, but his heart was in the right place, and so I think this is still worth reading. It is still good, it's still meaningful, it still has things to say to us today. Next up, we've got Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book is wonderful. I'm a huge fan of this one. It's make sure you read the 1818 version, because there was a version in like the 1830s that was kind of edited, and it's not as good. So the original version, 1818 version, is the best. Frankenstein is a classic for a reason. It's not just melodrama. It's very much has something to say, and I love the way the stories are nested. You've got the captain writing letters and the kind of on the outside, and then he meets Victor, and then we get Victor's story, and Victor's told there, and then Victor meets the monster, and the monster tells his story, and that's kind of in the center of the novel, and then it goes back to Victor's story, and then it goes back to the captain's story, and it's so well crafted. This book is wonderful. Please read it. It's nothing like the 1931 movie. It's better. And finally, on this very large list, we've got David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This is a big favorite of mine. It's a huge book. Audible has a version that's narrated by Richard Armitage that's so good. He does all the voices, everything, just beautifully. It's just incredible. But this book is a coming-of-age tale. The characters in this are wonderful. There's people here that like you really grow to like love and adore over time. There's also some really horrible villains that you love to hate because they're just awful people, and they get their comeuppance in good ways, and it's very satisfying. This is such a great book, and don't be thrown off by the length. It's very episodic, and it's engaging enough that you'll fly through it. So this book is wonderful. David Copperfield, Charles Dickens, wonderful. I loved it. And that takes us to the end of the 100 greatest books ever written. That was a very long list. I hope you stuck with me through part 1 and 2. If there's any of these books that you have read and you loved, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If there's any that you think shouldn't be on this list, let me know in the comments as well. Coming up with a list like this is always hard because it's always going to be subjective. There's always going to be books that are left out. I noticed there was nothing on this list by Virginia Woolf, and I think she is incredible and a really important writer. And then there's other things that are on this list that I was like, really? Is that on this list? So any list is going to be subjective. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these and what you are planning on reading based on these, maybe, hopefully. Maybe not. You don't have to feel pressured to read anything. But that is it for now. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, enjoy your reading, and I will see you then. Bye.